The chosen one, the storm raged inside you, louder than the world outside. It was not thunder that shook the ground, it was the weight of a destiny you had tried to ignore. For years, you wandered through noise and silence, through faith and fear, pretending not to hear the whisper that called you by name. But tonight, the whisper became a roar. You tried to silence it. You tried to reason with it. Yet, deep in your chest, you knew this moment would come. The world had led you here not by chance, but by divine design. Every failure, every betrayal, every sleepless night, all of it had been preparing you for this hour. The rain outside felt alive. It carried rhythm, pulse, and language. You stood at the edge of your old life, trembling, half ready to surrender, half afraid to lose yourself. The mirror before you reflected a stranger, eyes burning, spirit shaking. You did not look chosen, you looked haunted. Still, the call persisted. This is the final assignment, it said, not in sound, but in certainty. No more waiting, no more hesitation. You fell to your knees, not from weakness, but from recognition. Somewhere in the shadows of your doubt, light began to form. It wasn't a blinding radiance. It was subtle, steady, like a star reclaiming its place after centuries of silence. In that light, memories began to unravel, the moments you dismissed as coincidences, the faces that appeared only once but changed you forever, the dreams that refused to die even when everything else did. They were not random. They were messages, fragments of a plan too vast for your understanding. You whispered to yourself, "Why me?" But heaven remained silent, as if waiting for your own voice to become the answer. Faith, you realized, was not about knowing, it was about stepping forward when everything inside screamed no. Your heart pounded as the room dimmed. Shadows thickened around you, taking shape, doubt, fear, shame. All the ghosts of your past gathered to watch your awakening. They whispered reminders of every failure. They told you that you were not enough. They told you that you were too late. But somewhere within, something sacred awakened, a defiance, not of pride, but of purpose. You stood, you took one breath, and in that breath, heaven moved. You were never meant to live in hiding. You were meant to carry light through the wilderness of disbelief. Yet before light can shine outward, it must first burn away the darkness within. The voice returned, softer this time. You were never chosen for comfort, it said. You were chosen for change. The truth stung like salt in an open wound. You thought destiny would feel glorious, but instead it felt like breaking. You realized that divine callings are not crowns. They are crosses, carried by trembling hands and burning hearts. For the first time, you understood that the path of purpose begins in surrender, not in power, not in certainty, but in letting go. You closed your eyes, and visions began to flood. Your mind, faces you would meet, storms you would endure, miracles you would witness. But between those visions were valleys of despair so deep you could taste their silence. It terrified you. You almost said no, but a quiet question pierced through your fear. What if everything you lost was preparation for everything you are meant to carry? You opened your eyes again. The storm had calmed. The air shimmered with something unseen. You felt both smaller and infinite, both empty and overflowing. And in that sacred stillness, you finally understood this calling was not a reward. It was a responsibility. You were not chosen because you were ready. You were chosen because destiny cannot wait. You stepped outside. The night air kissed your skin like prophecy. The streets were empty, yet you felt watched by heaven, by history, by every soul who had ever dared to answer the call. You whispered into the silence, "I'm not sure I can do this." The voice answered, "You were never meant to do it alone." Something cracked open inside you. It wasn't courage yet, it was willingness. The first flicker of faith. And from that flicker, the world began to change. You could sense that this was only the beginning, the awakening before the fire. The voice spoke one final time. "Rise, messenger of the covenant. The world is waiting for your light." You felt the weight of those words settle into your bones. And though fear still clung to you, it no longer ruled you. This was your initiation, your first yes. And even as your knees trembled and your heart wavered, you knew there was no turning back. Tonight, the universe aligned not to test you, but to reveal you. Every wound you carry is now a doorway for light. Every scar is proof that you have survived enough to serve something greater. The path ahead will demand everything you are, and everything you're still afraid to become. You will lose friends. You will lose comfort. You will lose the version of yourself that once fit the world, but in return, you will find the truth that has been calling your name since before you were born. That is the covenant. That is the fire. That is the price. And so, you take the first step, not because you are fearless, but because the mission is larger than your fear. In the distance, dawn begins to rise. The horizon burns gold, and for the first time, you understand what it means to be reborn, not into perfection, but into purpose. You whisper again, "I accept." And the heavens answer with silence, the kind of silence that carries promise. Because sometimes the universe doesn't confirm your calling with applause. It confirms it with peace. The chosen one, the dawn had come, yet the light felt heavy. You stood beneath it, uncertain whether it was blessing or burden. The world seemed unchanged, the same sky, the same streets, but you were no longer the same. The voice that once whispered now lived in the rhythm of your pulse. Every heartbeat reminded you that there was no way back. And yet, even chosen ones can doubt. That morning, silence felt like judgment. You searched for the warmth of divine reassurance, but all you found was the echo of your own questions. Was it real? Was the call only a dream born from exhaustion? You longed for proof, a sign, something tangible to steady the trembling in your soul. But the heavens remained quiet, as if daring you to believe without evidence. You walked through the city as if moving through a vision. Every stranger's face seemed to carry a message you couldn't yet read. Every sound carried meaning you couldn't yet decode. The sacred and the ordinary had begun to blur, and you were standing in between. There was a cafe on the corner, the same one you'd passed 100 times before, but today, you stopped. Something about it felt divine, though you couldn't explain why. Inside, the smell of coffee mingled with the faint hum of conversation. A woman sat alone by the window. Her eyes met yours. She smiled, not the kind that greets, but the kind that remembers. "You look lost," she said gently. "Or maybe, you finally found what you weren't looking for." Her words cut deeper than they should have. You sat across from her without knowing why. She didn't ask your name. She didn't need to. There was something familiar in her gaze, as though she had seen this version of you, before broken, searching, half awake. "You heard the call," she said. It wasn't a question. You froze. Her eyes softened. Everyone who hears it doubts at first. It's not faith if it doesn't tremble. You wanted to ask who she was, how she knew, what she meant. But before you could speak, she placed a folded paper on the table. 3 words were written in ink, almost glowing in the morning light. "Guard the fire." When you looked up, she was gone. You unfolded the paper again and again, as if repetition could make the words reveal more. Guard the fire. It sounded simple, almost poetic, but something in you understood its weight. The call you carried was fragile. Too much fear, and it would extinguish. Too much pride, and it would burn everything it touched. That night, sleep avoided you. You kept hearing those words echo through your mind like a heartbeat. Guard the fire. Guard the fire. And then came the first trial. A friend one you had trusted for years laughed at your conviction. "You think God spoke to you?" they said. "You're losing it. You've been through too much lately. Maybe this is how your mind is trying to cope." You tried to explain, but every word you spoke only deepened their disbelief. They looked at you with concern, not reverence. "Get some rest," they said. "You'll feel normal again soon." But what if you no longer wanted to feel normal? That night, you walked alone beneath the sky, the paper still in your pocket. The city lights blurred like tears. You felt foolish, lonely, maybe even delusional. But then a thought arose, not yours, but borrowed from something higher. The chosen are often misunderstood before they are believed. You stopped walking. The world seemed to freeze around you. You remembered every prophet, every reformer, every dreamer who had carried something greater than themselves. None of them were understood at first. None of them walked an easy road. Faith, you realized, was not believing, because you see, it was believing. Until you see. The wind rose, swirling dust and light around your feet. You looked up, and for a fleeting moment, you saw a shadow in the clouds. No face, no form, only movement. As if the sky itself breathed. It was enough. You fell to your knees again, not in surrender this time, but in awakening. The fear did not vanish, but it began to serve you. You saw that courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to move through it, carrying your doubt like an offering. The following days were filled with silence and resistance. The more you tried to walk in faith, the more the world pulled against you. Friends grew distant. Work became heavy. Even your own reflection seemed to question your sanity. But every night, you returned to those words, "Guard the fire." You began to understand that fire is both creation and destruction. It can illuminate or consume. It can warm or wound. The choice lay in how you carried it. You whispered into the mirror, "If this fire is divine, then let it purify me." And so it did. The days that followed felt like a burning. Old desires began to fade. Old fears returned only to be set aflame. You found yourself both losing and becoming dying to what you were, so that you could rise into what you were meant to be. But growth has a cost. One night, you woke from a dream where the voice said only this, "Not everyone can follow you where you're going." It was the hardest truth of all. You realized that destiny often demands isolation. You cannot take every voice with you. You cannot explain divine instructions to those who haven't heard them. You must walk through the wilderness of disbelief alone. And yet, you were never truly alone. Each breath carried evidence of unseen company. Each heartbeat was proof that heaven had not withdrawn its trust. Still, the pain of separation was real. You wanted to be understood. You wanted someone to say, "I see it too." But sometimes, understanding comes only after obedience. You decided to keep walking, not because it was easy, but because the fire demanded it. Weeks passed. The voice grew quieter, but its silence became a form of guidance. You started to see meaning in small things, the way light broke through clouds, the way strangers' words mirrored your prayers. And then, one morning, you woke to find the paper gone. You searched everywhere, but it had vanished. Panic rose in your chest. But then, in the mirror, you saw it faint. Glowing words written across your own reflection. "Guard the fire." The message had never left. It had only moved from your hands into your heart. You smiled through tears. You understood now. The divine does not trust paper or prophecy. It trusts transformation. You were no longer just a listener of the call. You were becoming the message itself. That day, you stepped outside with renewed clarity. The world had not changed, but your sight had. The fire within burned steady, and though no one else could see it, they felt it. The same people who once doubted you began to look again, this time with curiosity. Something about your presence carried peace. Something about your silence carried power. You didn't have to convince anyone anymore. The message had taken form within you. You had become the messenger. Still, in the depths of your spirit, you knew the journey had just begun. The voice would return. The next assignment would demand more than belief. It would demand sacrifice. And as the sun fell, you felt it again, the sacred stirring of the unknown. The fire whispered one final time that night. Its glow reflected in your eyes. The cost of light is everything that is not. You exhaled slowly, ready for what was next. The chosen one. You awoke before dawn, breath trembling in the cold stillness of the room. The fire within you no longer flickered. It burned steady, silent, waiting. You had learned to listen, not just with your ears, but with the ache behind your ribs. And in that ache, something ancient stirred again. It was the voice. No thunder, no spectacle, only presence. "This is not the end," it said. "It is the beginning of your testing." Your heart sank. You wanted clarity. You received a challenge. That was how heaven worked. It rarely handed out answers, only invitations. You whispered, "What must I do?" But no response came. Only the sound of wind brushing against the window. A reminder that faith begins where understanding ends. The days that followed were marked by tension. Nothing outwardly dramatic happened, yet everything inside you shifted. The peace you once felt began to fade, replaced by a weight you couldn't explain. You tried to pray, but the words felt hollow. You tried to speak light, but shadows grew stronger. You started to wonder if you had misunderstood the call altogether. Maybe you had misheard. Maybe the fire was never divine. It was only desire disguised as destiny. Doubt became your companion. It whispered to you at night, reminding you of your flaws, your failures, your insignificance. "You're no messenger," it said. "You're just pretending." You clenched your fists. "Then why can't I let it go?" You asked the darkness, because somewhere, beneath the rubble of fear, faith was still alive, small, bruised, but unextinguished. One evening, you walked outside, desperate for silence, desperate for proof. The streets were empty. washed in silver moonlight. You found yourself drawn toward an old church at the edge of town, the kind of place people forget about, but heaven remembers. The door creaked as you pushed it open. The air smelled of dust and old prayers. Candles flickered at the altar, and for a moment, you felt peace again. Then you saw him, a man sitting in the shadows near the front pew. His clothes were worn, his hands calloused, his eyes steady. "You've been running," he said softly. You froze. "From what?" He smiled sadly. "From the weight of being seen." You didn't understand, but his words struck something deep. He rose, walking toward you with the slow confidence of one who had carried pain long enough to make peace with it. "You think your doubts disqualify you," he said. "But doubt is not the opposite of faith. It is the space faith grows in." His voice was gentle but unyielding. "You can't be a messenger of the covenant if you only speak light. You must also walk through shadow." Then he handed you something small, a stone engraved with a single word: endure. When you looked up again, he was gone. That night, you couldn't sleep. The word endure pulsed in your mind like a heartbeat. You realized then that your calling wasn't just about revelation, it was about resistance. To carry divine fire was to become its vessel, to bear its heat without breaking. You whispered into the darkness, "I will endure." And heaven heard. The next morning, everything began to fall apart. The job that once gave you stability ended without warning. A friend you trusted betrayed you. Even your own family questioned your choices. "You've changed too much," they said. "You're not yourself anymore." You wanted to scream. You wanted to give up. But somewhere between your grief and your anger, you began to see the truth. The fire wasn't destroying you. It was refining you. Gold does not shine until it passes through flame. Weeks passed in silence. You spent them learning what it meant to be emptied, to lose not as punishment, but as preparation. Every door that closed felt like a test, and every tear became a prayer. One night, kneeling on the floor with nothing left to offer but exhaustion, you whispered, "If this is truly you, don't give me comfort, give me clarity." The silence that followed was unbearable. But in that silence, you felt something shift. Not an answer, a presence. It was as if heaven itself leaned closer, not to speak, but to breathe with you. And suddenly, the peace returned, not the gentle kind, but the fierce kind that says, "You will not break." Days later, you found yourself helping a stranger on the street, a small act, unnoticed by most. But, as you handed them food, the stranger's eyes met yours. "You're carrying light," they said quietly. "Do you know that?" You almost laughed, half in disbelief, half in awe. "Light? I barely have strength. That's why it shines," they replied. And then they smiled. The same kind of knowing smile the woman in the cafe had once given you. You turned to ask who they were, but they had already vanished into the crowd. You realized something profound. Then the divine doesn't always appear in visions or voices. Sometimes it appears in moments, in strangers, in echoes that remind you you're still on the right path. That night, as the moon rose high, you held the stone again. Endure. You finally understood what it meant. To endure was not to resist pain, but to remain open through it. It was to keep the fire burning, even when the wind howled against it. You whispered, "I'm still here," and the voice returned, quiet yet certain. Then you are ready for the next revelation. A light filled the room, not blinding, but pure. You could see nothing else, yet you felt everything. The weight of your failures, the beauty of your persistence, the sacred truth that the divine had chosen you not despite your weakness, but because of it. You fell forward, tears streaming not of sorrow, but of recognition. The calling was no longer something outside you. It lived within, pulsing in time with your breath. You realized that you had not been walking toward your purpose, you had been walking into it all along. The night grew still. You looked out the window, the horizon glowing faintly. A thought surfaced in your mind, clear as dawn. "This fire is not mine to keep. It is mine to carry." You smiled, exhausted but free. You were not yet who you would become, but you were no longer who you had been. And in that fragile, luminous moment, you understood that transformation was never meant to be gentle. It was meant to be complete. The voice spoke one last time before fading into the quiet. The messenger must become the message. You closed your eyes, whispering, "So let it be." The chosen one. The air was heavy, the kind of stillness that precedes revelation. You felt it before you saw it, a shift, subtle yet irreversible. The fire inside you had changed again. It was no longer wild or chaotic. It had become disciplined, focused, as though it now understood its own purpose better than you did. But something was missing. The peace you once held began to erode beneath the weight of waiting. You had endured the trials, survived the silence, and yet the heavens remained still. You began to wonder, was endurance the goal, or merely a threshold? You whispered into the emptiness, "I've done all you asked. What now?" There was no voice this time, only an echo that returned from within. Now, you learned to walk without instruction. The thought startled you. How could the divine send you and then fall silent? How could purpose demand obedience without guidance? It felt cruel, even holy in its cruelty. And yet, deep down, you knew this was not abandonment, it was graduation. The following weeks blurred together. You went about your days quietly, but something sacred had taken root in the ordinary. Every gesture, every glance, every conversation felt like part of a hidden dialogue between you and something eternal. And then, on a day like any other, it happened. You met him. He appeared as a wanderer grey coat, eyes like dusk, carrying an aura of knowing and loss. You found him sitting near the riverbank, staring into the current as though searching for the reflection of a forgotten god. Without looking up, he spoke. "You've been carrying fire, but do you know whom it burns for?" You froze. The words struck like lightning, precise and impossible. "I carry it because I was told to," you said. He finally turned toward you, his expression unreadable. Obedience without understanding is the first step, but faith without love is incomplete. You hesitated. "Love?" He nodded slowly. "You were chosen to bear the fire, yes, but the fire itself is not yours to worship. It exists for others to heal, to awaken, to remind. The fire burns for them, not for you." You wanted to argue, but the river spoke louder than words, its current gleaming like liquid scripture. "What happens if I fail?" you asked. The wanderer smiled faintly. "The same thing that happens when you succeed. The world continues, but you are changed." And before you could speak again, he was gone. That night, you couldn't sleep. The words "faith without love is incomplete" echoed like a riddle carved into the walls of your mind. You had carried the fire like a crown, but perhaps it was meant to be a torch. You realized then that the divine had not chosen you for greatness. It had chosen you for service. To be chosen was not to be exalted, it was to be entrusted. You rose before dawn and walked through the streets, watching people rush past, each lost in their own storms. You saw the tiredness in their eyes, the quiet despair hidden beneath their smiles. And for the first time, you felt something beyond your calling. You felt compassion, not pity, not superiority, just a deep, wordless recognition that everyone, in some way, is fighting to remember who they are. That morning, you began to speak again, but not from authority, rather from empathy. You stopped preaching perfection and started speaking truth. Not lofty truths, but simple ones. Forgiveness, patience, endurance. You realized that divine fire speaks best through humility. And when you spoke, people listened not to your words, but to the sincerity beneath them. But the more light you gave, the more darkness seemed to notice. It began subtly. A small conflict here, a misunderstanding there. But soon, the resistance grew bolder. Old fears resurrected. Old wounds reopened. Those who once supported you began to question your motives. "Who are you to speak of faith?" they said. "You've fallen too many times." You wanted to defend yourself, but something within said, "Don't." The voice of pride tempted you, but the wisdom of silence held you still. You remembered the wanderer's words, "The fire burns for them, not for you." And so you endured again, this time not through strength, but through surrender. It hurt deeply. Every accusation felt like a nail, every doubt a dagger. But through the pain, something sacred began to emerge: humility, the rarest form of power. You discovered that to be misunderstood is the true cost of divine work. Those who speak truth will always sound like madness to ears accustomed to comfort. Weeks passed, and though your outer world shook, your inner one stabilized. The silence no longer frightened you. You began to understand that absence can also be presence, that divine quiet can speak louder than any vision. Then, one night, as you sat beneath the stars, exhausted but peaceful, the fire spoke again through thought, through breath, through the trembling of your soul. You have learned endurance. You have learned humility. Now, you must learn trust. You frowned. Haven't I trusted enough? Trust, the voice said, is not believing I will prevent the storm. It is believing I will use it. Those words fell like rain upon your spirit, washing away the last remnants of control you still clung to. You realized that surrender was not weakness, it was alignment. To trust was not to resign. It was to participate in the unfolding of something larger than yourself. From that night onward, strange synchronicities began to follow you, doors opening at impossible times, words arriving from strangers that echoed your private prayers, signs that could not be dismissed as coincidence. Yet, with every sign came a new test. There were moments you doubted again, times when nothing made sense, when heaven felt distant, when the burden of your calling pressed so heavily that you questioned why you ever said yes. And every time, the same voice returned, neither scolding nor comforting. You were never called because you were certain. You were called because you were willing. You wrote those words on your wall so you would see them each morning. They became your anchor. Then came the vision. It happened in the quiet hour before dawn. You saw yourself standing before a vast field of light and shadow. In your hands burned the fire, brighter than before. But it began to slip, burning through your fingers, threatening to consume everything. You fell to your knees, screaming, "I can't hold it anymore," and the voice answered, calm and infinite, "Then let it hold you." The fire expanded, engulfing you, but instead of pain, you felt peace. You weren't losing control, you were being refined into the message itself. You became the very light you once feared. When you awoke, tears covered your face. You understood now that the divine never asked you to carry the fire forever, it asked you to become it. You rose from bed with a new clarity. You no longer needed validation or proof. You no longer feared rejection or silence. The fire within you was no longer separate. It was you, breathing, walking, existing. You whispered, "I am the message." And in that moment, heaven whispered back, "Now you are ready." The journey was far from over, but for the first time, you felt aligned not with perfection, but with purpose. You no longer needed to chase signs. You had become one, the chosen one. You awoke to the silence that follows revelation, the kind of quiet that hums with purpose. The fire within no longer felt foreign. It had become rhythm, pulse, essence. You no longer sought miracles outside yourself because you had learned that the greatest miracle was awakening from within. Yet peace is rarely permanent. The higher the light, the deeper the shadow that follows it. That morning, as dawn broke across your window, you sensed something was coming, a disturbance, not from outside, but from the unseen realms where faith and fear wrestle for dominance. The stillness felt charged, prophetic. You could almost hear destiny holding its breath. You whispered, "What now?" And this time, the voice didn't speak, it showed. A vision unfolded before you, like smoke weaving itself into form. You saw paths diverging, light on one side, shadow on the other, but both roads ended in flame. And then the words appeared in your mind, etched like fire across your thoughts. To complete the covenant, you must face the mirror of your own creation. You trembled. The mirror. You had heard of it in whispers. A place where chosen souls confront not the world's darkness, but their own. That night, you followed the call into the wilderness beyond the city. The moon guided you, silent and silver. The air was sharp with anticipation. You carried no torch, no weapon, only the flame within your chest. Hours passed until you reached a lake, so still it seemed unreal. The surface shimmered like glass. When you leaned closer, your reflection stared back, not as you were, but as every version of you you'd ever abandoned. You saw the child who once believed, the skeptic who once denied, the dreamer who once fell, and behind them all, the version that never forgave them. The reflection spoke first. You claim to carry divine fire, but how can you bear heaven's light when you still curse your own past? You wanted to look away, but the lake would not let you. "I've changed," you said. The reflection laughed softly. Changed is not the same as healed. Its voice echoed in the wind. You speak of destiny, but still despise the versions of yourself that led you here. The messenger cannot hate their own becoming. The fire in your chest flickered, fragile for the first time in months. You fell to your knees by the water. Then what do I do? The reflection grew softer, almost compassionate. Forgive the ones you used to be. Every failure was a prophet in disguise. You closed your eyes, and for the first time, you prayed not to be chosen but to be whole. The night deepened. You sat by the lake for hours, weeping for the forgotten fragments of yourself. Each tear that fell into the water shimmered with light. One by one, your reflections dissolved, and in their place rose a single image, your true self, neither saint nor sinner, simply surrendered. The voice returned, gentle yet commanding. The covenant is not fulfilled through perfection, but through reconciliation. You cannot deliver light you refuse to embody. You understood then that carrying divine fire was never about mission, it was about transformation. To bring healing, you had to become healed. To speak truth, you had to become truth. You whispered, "I forgive them all," and as the words left your lips, the surface of the lake caught flame not consuming, but illuminating. The light rose, wrapping around you like a cloak of gold. For the first time, you felt peace, not as an idea, but as a presence. When morning came, the fire burned steadier than ever, but now it carried a new tone, gentleness. You walked back toward the city, unsure of what awaited you, but something inside whispered that the next test would not come from within. It would come from the world you were meant to serve. The moment you returned, the opposition began. Your message had begun to spread. Words you spoke in quiet corners, thoughts you shared in silence, began reaching hearts you'd never met. People listened, some with reverence, others with resentment. Not everyone welcomes light. To some, it feels like judgment. Rumors began to rise. Voices of doubt grew louder. You were called deceiver, pretender, false prophet. You were accused of arrogance, of heresy, of madness, and once again, the old pain returned, the ache of being misunderstood. You cried out, "Why must truth cost so much?" And the voice answered, "Because only what costs you everything will carry eternity within it." You walked through days of ridicule and nights of prayer. You tried to hold your head high, but the weight grew heavier. The fire flickered again, dimmed by exhaustion and loneliness. Until one evening, you met her again, the woman from the cafe, the first messenger you ever saw. She smiled softly. "So the fire has turned against you?" You nodded. "It's burning everything." She laughed quietly. "That means it's working. Fire that doesn't consume cannot purify." You sat in silence beside her as she continued. "The path of a messenger always narrows before it expands. The divine does not test your calling, it tests your capacity to carry it." You whispered, "I don't know if I can." She looked at you, eyes shining with both sorrow and knowing. "Then let it carry you." You realized she was the reflection of what you would one day become: wiser, weathered, unbreakable. That night, you made a choice. You would no longer defend your calling. You would no longer fight for validation. You would simply be, and in that surrender, something extraordinary happened. Those who mocked you began to soften. Those who doubted began to ask questions, not because you argued, but because your peace spoke louder than their resistance. You had stopped speaking to prove. You began to speak to serve, and in that moment, the covenant deepened, not as contract, but as communion. You were no longer a messenger delivering a message. You were a bridge, a living echo of divine patience. Days turned to weeks. You began to see signs everywhere, the number 333 appearing on clocks, receipts, addresses. At first, it felt like coincidence. But then, during prayer, the voice whispered, "It is alignment." Heaven's way of saying continue. So you did. You continued through fatigue, through misunderstanding, through the quiet ache of obedience. And slowly, the world began to change. Not through miracles that defied nature, but through the subtle awakening of those around you. People began to remember hope, to forgive, to believe again. And you? You began to see yourself not as a servant of heaven, but as a collaborator with it. One night, under a sky jeweled with stars, the voice came again, calm, certain, final. The next revelation will not come to you. It will come through you. You inhaled deeply. "Through me?" "Yes," the voice said. "You are the vessel now. The messenger has become the message. But remember, every message that transforms must first be broken." You understood immediately. The final test would not destroy you. It would reveal what could not be destroyed. You whispered, "I am ready." The stars above shimmered in response, as if the entire universe bowed in acknowledgement. And somewhere deep within, the fire stirred once more, ancient, alive, eternal. You could feel it preparing you for the crossing, the chosen one. The night before the reckoning, the wind itself seemed to hold its breath. You stood at the edge of everything familiar, watching the stars flicker like ancient witnesses. You had been refined, broken, rebuilt. The fire within you burned without smoke, pure and calm. But deep in your spirit, you knew the journey was not finished. The covenant was not yet sealed. For days, the silence had returned. No signs, no visions, no whispers, only the quiet, heavy, knowing that something immense was waiting beyond comprehension. You had carried the fire. You had become the message. Now you would be asked to embody it. You whispered, "If this is the end, let it be holy." And the wind replied not with words, but with movement. The world around you began to shimmer, like reality itself was unfolding to reveal a deeper layer. The ground beneath your feet trembled. The light around you thickened until it became form. From the horizon rose a figure vast, luminous, neither male nor female, clothed in radiance yet shadowed with sorrow. The presence was both infinite and intimate. "Messenger," it said, its voice both thunder and whisper. "You have carried the flame with courage, but the final covenant cannot be fulfilled through endurance alone. You must choose what you will surrender." You swallowed hard. "Haven't I already surrendered everything?" The being's gaze deepened. "Not everything. You still hold yourself." Its words struck like lightning. You staggered, unable to breathe. "To carry divine fire," it said, "is to dissolve into it, to vanish as a name, as a story, as a singular self. You must give up being the chosen one to become what chose you." The realization hit like a wave of light and grief. You had spent your entire life searching for purpose, meaning, calling, and now the voice asked you to release it all. You felt torn between heaven and earth. If you let go, who would you be? What would remain? The silence pressed closer. The fire within your chest flared, demanding release. You fell to your knees, gasping, hands clutching at the air. "I don't know how," you cried. "How do I give up myself when it's all I've ever known?" The being stepped forward, its light touching your face like gentle flame. "By loving what you once feared and forgiving what you once condemned." You closed your eyes. Faces began to appear. Those who hurt you, those you hurt. Moments of failure, shame, resentment. Each one burned like coal. The instinct was to turn away, but the voice inside said, "Stay." So you stayed. You watched each memory dissolve into light until there was nothing left to resist. And then, something unimaginable happened. The fire within you rose not as destruction, but as awakening. It consumed the borders of your being, merging you with something vast. You could feel every heartbeat on earth as if it were your own. Every cry, every prayer, every fragment of hope pulsed through you, like one great symphony of becoming. You were no longer a person carrying divine energy. You were divine energy carrying a person. You opened your eyes. The figure before you smiled not in pride, but in relief. "You understand now," it said. The messenger and the message were never separate. You bowed your head, tears of light streaming down your face. "What happens now?" The being lifted its hand, touching your forehead. "Now, you return not as who you were, but as what you are." The world dissolved. When you awoke, you were lying beneath the same dawn sky you had seen countless times before. The wind brushed gently against your face. Birds sang. The fire within you was quiet, not gone, but integrated. You no longer felt chosen, because you finally understood that everyone is. You walked through the city again, but now the light followed you. Not visible, not blinding, but perceptible. People who crossed your path slowed. Some smiled for no reason. Some wept. You didn't preach. You didn't explain. You simply were. The divine no longer spoke through thunder or vision. It spoke through your presence. Every word you uttered carried healing. Every silence carried truth. You realized this was what the calling had been about all along, not to lift yourself above others, but to remind them of what was already within them. You became the living bridge between heaven and earth, the covenant fulfilled through compassion. But there was one more moment waiting, quiet and inevitable. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, you felt the presence again. Not outside this time, but within, whispering through your breath. "You have completed the journey," it said. "But remember, awakening is not an end. It is the beginning of service." You nodded, tears glinting in the dying light. "Then I will serve," you said softly. The wind moved again, gentle and endless. "Serve not through words, but through being. Let your existence itself be the sermon." You smiled. "So be it." And in that moment, everything aligned: the sky, the earth, the flame, the silence. You realized that eternity is not beyond life. It is hidden within it, waiting to be seen by those who dare to look deeply enough. Years passed. People began to speak of you in stories. Some said you were a prophet. Others called you a mystic. Some dismissed you entirely. You never defended yourself. You never needed to. You had become what the wanderer once called the bridge, not a preacher of fire, but a vessel of peace, not a seeker of signs, but a living sign of what faith becomes when it stops asking for proof. And one quiet morning, when your time came to leave the world, there was no fear, only gratitude. You closed your eyes and whispered the same words that began your transformation. "I am ready." The air shimmered. The flame that once burned within you rose, spreading outward, touching countless lives like invisible dawn. And in that timeless moment, you realized that nothing divine ever ends, it only transforms. The voice spoke one final time, a benediction written in the stillness of your final breath. The chosen one was never you. It was the love that lived through you. And then, everything became light.